Hey everybody, welcome back. Another video for you. Thank you again to those of you who have reached out, who have shown your support in various ways. Much appreciated. Glad to be providing a service that people find valuable. Want to talk about a couple of issues today in the time that I do have. It is the evening of March 16th. It is almost 10 o'clock on the East Coast of the United States. Lots going on. There are some developments on the ground. This is always going to be the case. I don't think that you necessarily need me to narrate each and every movement of Russian troops and the smaller victories and the smaller defeats and so forth. But what I will say is that a major development seems to be on the horizon with regard to negotiations. And I think that this is critical for us to talk about. It is the potential for peace if there is some kind of a negotiated settlement. This, of course, is the best case scenario for all involved, despite the frothing warmongers on Russian state media and on U.S. corporate media, the various Putin sycophants and Michael McFaul, U.S. military industrial complex lunatic types. If we could find a reasonable solution and avoid the spillover of a global conflict, that would be nice. So anyway, it does seem that indications are there that despite Putin's pretty extreme rhetoric in recent days, that the negotiating teams are moving towards hopefully a compromise, dare I say breakthrough. Specifically, what looks to be on the table are three primary issues, and this would be, I mean, for all intents and purposes, this would be handing a victory to the Russians, but I guess that depends on how you look at it. The first is some sort of military neutrality on the part of Ukraine, akin to Austria, akin to various other examples in European history. I don't know whether this is necessarily the sticking point in this entire negotiation, but I do think that it is something that the Russians are probably pretty keen to insist on, given that, oh, I don't know, their military is currently occupying most major Ukrainian cities. The other one, of course, is no accession to NATO, no NATO membership for Ukraine. This would be a given. This is probably at least this one of the primary stated objectives on the part of Putin. So clearly, that would be one of the sticking points. And the third, I think, that's obvious and that seems to be pretty much part and parcel of the first two is no foreign bases on Ukrainian soil, no foreign military advisors and other things of that nature. Whether or not they're going to be able to get all of that, that is to say, the Russians, whether or not they're going to be able to get all of that, I suppose that remains to be seen. But as long as the Russians can continue battering these Ukrainian cities and degrading Ukraine's military and reducing to rubble whole neighborhoods, well, I hate to say it, but they do have a tremendous amount of leverage in negotiations and they can certainly insist upon certain things. Now, the broader picture here, to leave aside the sort of moral considerations of, giving in to Putin, which is, I think, not appropriate talk, but the kind of talk you hear on, MSNBC and places like this, is the simple, sort of political reality that in order to avoid a broader conflict, Putin has to be able to get a win and sell a win domestically. And the way that he's going to be able to turn around to the Russian people and say, look, I did what I did. I inflicted this economic damage, this damage to our national prestige, and all of these other things in order to be able to have accomplished A, B, and C, specifically keeping Ukraine out of NATO, keeping NATO away from Russia's borders, etc., degrading their military, whatever he might say. If he is able to do this, then maybe, just maybe, we could find our way out of this conflict. Short of that, I don't see any reason to think that Putin is going to let up here. Nothing in his past seems to indicate that. And based on the decisions that we've seen over the last couple of weeks, it seems that he's going to get at least some of what he wants one way or another, because it's already pretty ugly and it can get a whole lot uglier. All right, I want to move on from there. And I will just say, actually, um, it's not all one-sided here. There's a lot of conflict on the Ukrainian side as well. There are elements, including far-right elements, both within, I guess, what you might call some of the institutions of the Ukrainian state, and also just in general in terms of political sentiment, that absolutely do not want these kinds of negotiations, that see that as some form of betrayal. There is a complex politics on both sides of this negotiation. The Ukrainians have zero trust, obviously, in the Russian side. They're quoted explicitly as stating that the Russians lie about everything, and that you have to really pin them down through sort of events on the ground. And I think part of the strategy on the Ukrainian side is to garner as much international support as they can in the form of weapons and other things, and drag this out as long as they can, and I guess you could say erode some of that leverage that Putin has. Um, you know, you hate to say it when you know that it's women and children and families and elderly people and others being bombed and killed and blown to pieces and all of this, but the reality is that this is war, and this is how wars go, and this is how wars end. Wars end not in, storybook kind of ways, but in sort of really ugly and nasty sort of compromises. So anyway, I want to talk a little bit about India. India is a very interesting player in all of this, what's happened globally. I've talked several times in recent videos about China. Of course, China is really critical to everything that Russia needs to do as far as continuing to exist within sort of the framework of these global sanctions, or at least sanctions from Western countries. And India is a very critical trading partner for Russia. And in fact, India seems to be a potential option for the Russians to evade some of these sanctions. There are already talks between the Indian central bank and the Russian authorities to potentially expand the local currency trade, that is to say, currency of rupees and rubles. So, in other words, not only eliminating the dollar as the intermediary, but evading the sanctions by, well, as it was described by one of the experts interviewed by the Financial Times, basically, the let's see, how does it work exactly? The payment in rubles from the Indian buyer goes to the Russian bank. The Russian bank pays back to the Indian seller in local rupees. So, in other words, the Russian bank, despite the fact that it can't access dollars and it can't make these international transactions, can still, through its branches in India, transfer this money. So that's basically how it's supposed to work. It's sort of a way of evading the international financial architecture that Russia's more or less been frozen out of. So India pays in rubles, gets paid in rubies, rubies, in rupees. So these kinds of deals are very interesting because historically India and Russia have been very close all throughout the Cold War. India and the Soviet Union were very close allies. They have remained pretty close allies, actually, even in recent times. Russia remains the primary supplier to India of military equipment, a primary supplier of energy, a primary supplier of fertilizer. Again, India being in a country where agrarian production, agricultural production at the local level, at the subsistence level, and at the small farm level is still crucial to the entire functioning of the country. So anyway, this deal is potentially going to happen. Now, before the sort of Kremlin cheerleaders get too hasty in, kicking their whatever it is cheerleaders do, um, the issue here is that a lot of experts are concerned that the Indians are never going to follow through with this because it risks a much larger catastrophe for India, that is pissing off the United States. The United States far outweighs the Russians in terms of an export market for India, upwards of $50 billion a year in Indian exports going to the United States. So if you think that the US is just going to sit back and watch as India provides an avenue for Russia to evade sanctions, not a chance. Not a chance. So this raises the question: how much does India value, you know, the relationship with the United States, obviously on the one hand, and the value the relationship with Russia on the other hand, and to what extent can Modi's government sort of walk the line between the two? It must be said that the Indian government, Modi's government, the BJP, is a far right government. They have a lot in common with Putin, with the sort of global far right project that Putin is in many ways. I don't know if you want to say necessarily the architect, but certainly one of the central figures of. And Modi and Putin are close in a lot of ways. So this is a very interesting question considering the India China competition, rivalry, simmering border conflict, all of those factors that play into this very odd kind of combination of alliances and conflicts between Russia, China, and India over a lot of these different issues. Now, India-Russia trade in 2021 totaled grand total of 8 billion. So it pales in comparison to the India-US relationship. However, according to projections, if you want to hear the optimistic ones from the Kremlin and from Delhi, it is supposed to grow in the next 5 years by, I think, at least double. So I don't know. I would be very cautious if I were making predictions about whether the Russians are going to be able to use India as a way of evading these sanctions, but they're certainly going to try. Okay, in the time that I have remaining, I want to talk about a very dangerous possibility that has to be discussed because, frankly, we need to be honest about the reality of what can happen and how this conflict can evolve and how it can spill over, and that is the real danger of spillover of the war in Ukraine back into Russia, whether in a genuine way or potentially in a false flag way. Now, the reason I bring up the false flag scenario is because I did come across an article from a well-known blogger named Alexander Kovalenko. Alexander Kovalenko's blog has, broken a lot of different things in the recent past. He is fairly prominent in the sort of Russia blogosphere. And Kovalenko, wherever he seems to have gotten information, whether we want to believe it or not, he is claiming that the Russians are preparing a false flag operation whereby they would shell their own cities on the Russian side of the Russia-Ukraine border from positions inside of Ukraine, specifically Russian border cities that would be shelled to then blame it on the Azov battalion, and specifically Regiment Commander Sergei Velichko of the Azov battalion. This is the claim that Kovalenko is making. This has been reported in a number of blogs. What can we say about this? This is part of the fog of all of this sort of conflict, is that, as I've said, information, misinformation, disinformation flying around from all sides so thick and so rapidly that it's very difficult and often very disorienting. I think what we can say is that the possibility of a provocation, whether genuine by the Ukrainian military or false flag carried out by the Russians for the purposes of carrying forward and sort of uniting their country around the war, and garnering more recruits and whatever else it might be. Whichever way it goes, this is going to be a disaster if it happens, and we do need to be prepared for the possibility that it does happen, because if Russian cities start getting shelled, this conflict can morph in very dangerous ways. Now, the real reason I bring this up, though, is not because I want to make a prediction about what is going to happen, because I have no idea what's going to happen. I have no idea if Kovalenko's, prediction of a false flag is accurate or not. But what I can say is that we already have seen historically the Putin regime carry out false flag operations for the purposes of pushing forward their war agenda. In fact, and this is part of the story that I think people probably have forgotten, a lot of people don't know, Putin's entire political existence is owed to a false flag event. We should not forget the Ryazan bombings or attempted bombings that led to the Second Chechen War. It is what solidified Putin as as the figure that he became, the president, etc. It is what made him. It put him in a position of public opinion and public support that he has basically never relinquished. His role in quote unquote uniting the country around their so-called 9/11, the Russian apartment bombings of that year. This was a critical, probably the critical moment that solidified Putin. Okay. And it was a false flag operation carried out by Russian intelligence for the purposes of essentially establishing a successor government to the corrupt and collapsing Yeltsin regime that would essentially solidify control in the hands of the oligarchs and ensure that, nobody ever opened up the books and nobody ever did figure out what happened in those days in the 1990s, right? So this was a false flag operation carried out by Russian intelligence for the purposes of basically putting Putin in power, more or less. And here we are 22 years later, considering the possibility of a false flag for the purposes of pushing forward a war agenda in Ukraine, very similar to the war agenda that was carried out in Chechnya. I mean, one can't help but see echoes of Grozny and the sort of, maybe carpet bombing is not exactly the right word, but the absolutely devastating bombardment of Grozny, Chechnya, and compare that to some of the scenes that, of just horrific and barbarous kind of brutality that we're seeing in the bombings in Ukraine. So it does raise the question, are the Russians potentially once again preparing to use their intelligence services and or military intelligence to carry out something like this? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not predicting a false flag. I am saying that this is historically well known. The research is all out there. Many books have been written on the subject. Many experts have, staked their careers on this. I mean, I don't have the books in front of me at the moment, but it doesn't matter. The point is that the invasion of Chechnya, the war that solidified Putin, was based on a false flag. It was carried out in a way that was designed to garner public support. It seems like a really opportune time for that to happen again. Okay, that's it for me for tonight. I would just ask, if you want more of this kind of stuff, go over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Eric Draitser. I got more to talk about. Putin gave a really nasty, pretty fascist speech the other day, and I'm going to do a close reading of that because I've long argued that Putin is not a fascist, but boy, hard to argue when you hear this speech. The other thing I want to talk about is the Black Sea. Nobody seems to be talking about Russia's Navy, what Russia's Navy is doing, the control of the Black Sea, control of the Sea of Azov, and movement towards Odessa. It's pretty freaking scary. Go over to the Patreon page. I'll have more there. Talk to you again next time.